The morning heat shimmered off the tarmac at Kadina Air Base like a living thing, and Rebecca Martinez felt it press against her shoulders as she walked the flight line alone. Her boots clicked against the concrete in a steady rhythm that had become her anthem over the past 18 months, the sound of someone who belonged but wasn't welcome. The typhoon brewing offshore had grounded all flights, leaving the base in that peculiar state of tense readiness that every airman knew by heart. Flight crews moved with practiced urgency around the grounded eagles, their voices sharp and clipped, as they called out final checks. The air tasted of hydraulic fluid and ozone, mixed with the salt-heavy scent of the approaching storm. Rebecca's name badge read "Support" in block letters beneath her name. No rank insignia, no squadron patch, just a function. Her flight gloves hung from a carabiner at her belt, unused but present, a small act of defiance that nobody seemed to notice anymore. In her left hand, she carried a weathered flight log, its corners soft from years of handling. She didn't need it for her current role, but she brought it anyway, the way some people carry photographs. Commander Bradley Nash stood near the operations center, his silver hair catching the fluorescent lights as he spoke to a group of younger pilots. Even from a distance, Rebecca could see the way the men leaned in when he talked, the way they nodded at his words like gospel. Nash had been her father's squadron leader 20 years ago, back when Captain Daniel Martinez flew storm tracking missions that made legends out of ordinary men. Legacy pilots making another inspection tour. One of the younger pilots muttered as Rebecca passed. The comment wasn't meant for her ears, but it wasn't whispered either. Think she's waiting for someone to hand her a pity ride? Rebecca didn't turn. She'd learned to let the words wash over her like rain, but they still stung. The thing about being a legacy pilot was that everyone expected you to either soar or crash spectacularly. There was no middle ground for quiet competence, no space for someone who read the wind instead of dominating it. She stopped at the edge of Hangar 3, where an old F-15C sat under a steel canopy, its paint faded, but its lines still sharp. The tail arch showed the ghost of old squadron markings, and Rebecca's chest tightened when she saw the designation. Juliet 4, her father's bird, kept in flying condition but never assigned to active duty. A museum piece with wings. The radio crackled from a nearby maintenance station. All aircraft remain grounded. Weather conditions below operational minimums. Repeat, no launches authorized without executive override. Rebecca opened her flight log and ran her finger down the hand-drawn charts she'd created the night before. While other pilots complained about the delay, she'd been mapping wind patterns, tracking the storm's movement with the precision her mother had taught her as a child. The corridor was there, a brief window of stability hidden inside the chaos. She could see it forming in the satellite data, feel it in the way the wind shifted against her face. Behind her, footsteps approached on the wet concrete. Rebecca didn't need to turn to know who it was. Commander Nash had a distinctive walk, purposeful and heavy, like a man who'd never questioned his right to be anywhere. "Martinez," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority and something else, disappointment, maybe. "Shouldn't you be conducting equipment inventory?" She turned slowly, keeping her expression neutral. "Yes, sir. Just checking weather conditions." Nash's eyes flicked to the flight log in her hands, then back to her face. "Weather monitoring isn't your responsibility anymore. That's what meteorology is for." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Rebecca had heard variations of this conversation more times than she could count. Always the same message delivered with the same tone of tired patience. Stay in your lane, accept your limitations. Stop reaching for something that wasn't meant for you. "I understand, sir. Do you?" Nash stepped closer, his voice dropping to a tone that was almost fatherly. "Rebecca, I knew your father. He was a hell of a pilot, one of the best storm riders I ever flew with. But this obsession with living up to his reputation, it's not helping anyone. The words hit harder than the muttered comments from the junior pilots. Nash wasn't being cruel, he was being kind, which somehow made it worse. Rebecca felt the familiar burn of tears behind her eyes, but she blinked them back. She'd learned early that tears were currency she couldn't afford to spend. Your father didn't die because he was fearless, Nash continued, his voice softer now. He died because he took a calculated risk that didn't pay off. The difference between courage and recklessness is measured in split seconds, and sometimes even the best pilots miscalculate. Rebecca's grip tightened on her flight log. I'm not my father, sir. No, Nash agreed. You're not. You're more cautious, more analytical. In most circumstances, that would be a strength. But in a fighter cockpit, hesitation kills. The review board made the right call when they moved you to support. It wasn't punishment, it was recognition. That your skills are better suited to other roles. The storm chose that moment to announce itself with a low rumble of thunder. Both Rebecca and Nash looked up at the darkening sky, where clouds moved with the restless energy of something barely contained. Storm's getting closer, Nash observed. We'll be lucky if it passes without causing damage. Rebecca looked at the clouds with different eyes. She saw the patterns within the chaos, the hidden geometry of pressure and wind that most people missed. There's a corridor forming on the southern approach, she said quietly. It'll be stable for about 30 seconds, maybe less. Nash followed her gaze, then shook his head. Satellites show solid cloud cover. No breaks predicted for the next 6 hours. The satellites are reading the storm's structure, not its movement, Rebecca said, then immediately regretted speaking. She'd learned that offering corrections to superior officers was a luxury she couldn't afford. Nash's expression hardened slightly. Martinez, I need you to understand something. Your father's reputation opens doors, but it also creates expectations. People are watching to see if you'll live up to the legend or become a cautionary tale. Right now, you're walking a very thin line. The message was clear. Stop pushing. Stop questioning. Stop being anything other than grateful for the role you've been given. Rebecca nodded, the gesture automatic after months of practice. I'll get back to the inventory, sir. Good. Nash turned to leave, then paused. And Martinez, I know you keep your father's flight log. That's fine. We all have our ways of remembering the dead. But don't let the past keep you from accepting your present. As he walked away, Rebecca felt the weight of his words settle over her like a blanket. She looked down at the flight log in her hands, its pages filled with her father's careful notations and her own attempts to understand the language of wind and weather. Maybe Nash was right. Maybe she was chasing ghosts. But as she turned back toward the hangar, her eyes caught movement in the clouds above. The storm was shifting, creating the exact corridor she'd predicted. For just a moment, the wind carved a path through the chaos, a window of opportunity that existed for 30 seconds before closing again. Nobody else had seen it. Nobody else had been looking. Rebecca smiled for the first time in weeks. Nash might be right about a lot of things, but he was wrong about one crucial detail. She wasn't living in her father's shadow. She was learning to read the sky the way he had, with patience and precision rather than speed and aggression. The storm was coming, and with it her chance to prove that sometimes the quiet ones see what others miss. The mess hall at Kadina buzzed with the particular energy that came before a storm. Pilots clustered around tables, their voices rising and falling like the wind outside, discussing flight hours and weather delays with the easy confidence of men who'd never questioned their place in the world. Rebecca sat alone at a corner table, picking at her lunch while reading meteorological reports on her tablet. "Hey, Legacy!" a voice called from across the room. "You figure out how to fly through that typhoon yet?" Rebecca looked up to see Lieutenant Jake Morrison grinning at her from a table full of active pilots. Morrison was everything she wasn't: loud, confident, and utterly convinced of his own invincibility. His call sign was Hotshot, which would have been ironic if he weren't actually that good. "Still working on it," Rebecca replied, keeping her voice level. "Maybe you should stick to what you know," Morrison continued, encouraged by the chuckles from his tablemates. "I hear support personnel are real good at counting rivets." The comment drew more laughter, but Rebecca noticed that not everyone was joining in. Senior Master Sergeant David Cole, a maintenance chief with 30 years of experience, shook his head and muttered something under his breath. Technical Sergeant Amanda Rodriguez, one of the few women in the maintenance crew, shot Morrison a disgusted look. "Some people never learn when to shut up," Rodriguez said loud enough for the room to hear. Morrison's grin faltered slightly. "Just making conversation, Rodriguez. No harm intended." "Right." Rodriguez stood up, her tray in hand. "Because nothing says no harm like mocking someone for something they can't control." The tension in the room shifted, and Rebecca felt every eye turn toward her. This was the moment when she was supposed to say something, to defend herself or make a joke to defuse the situation. Instead, she closed her tablet and stood up. "I need to get back to work," she said simply. As she walked toward the exit, she heard Morrison call after her. "Hey, Martinez. No hard feelings, right? We're all on the same team here." Rebecca paused. At the door, the smart thing would be to nod and smile, to show that she could take a joke. But something in Morrison's tone, the casual dismissal, the assumption that she should be grateful for his attention, made her turn around. "Are we?" she asked. "Are we what?" "On the same team." Rebecca's voice was quiet, but it carried clearly across the now silent mess hall. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're playing a different game." Morrison's face flushed red. "Look, I didn't mean." "You meant exactly what you said," Rebecca interrupted. "You meant that I don't belong here, that I'm taking up space that should go to someone more deserving. And you know what? You might be right." She turned and walked out before anyone could respond, leaving behind a room full of uncomfortable silence. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the first drops of rain spattered against the concrete. Rebecca pulled her jacket tighter and walked toward the operations building, her mind racing. The truth was, Morrison's words stung because they echoed her own doubts. Every morning, she woke up wondering if she was fooling herself, if her careful analysis of weather patterns and wind corridors was just an elaborate way of avoiding the fact that she wasn't cut out for this life. Her father had been a natural pilot, someone who could feel the airplane's responses in his bones. Rebecca had to think about every input, calculate every risk. Maybe that was why she'd been grounded. Maybe careful wasn't enough. The operations building was quieter than usual. Most of the staff focused on monitoring the approaching storm. Rebecca made her way to the back office where she'd been assigned to catalog equipment, inventories, a job that was important but felt like punishment. She settled at her desk and opened the first box of maintenance records, trying to lose herself in the familiar rhythm of data entry. "Martinez." The voice belonged to Master Sergeant Cole, who appeared in her doorway with a cup of coffee in his weathered hands. "Got a minute?" Rebecca looked up, surprised. Cole was legendary among the ground crews, a man who'd served on 3 different bases and could diagnose an engine problem by sound alone. He'd never spoken to her directly before. "Yes, Sergeant, what can I do for you?" Cole stepped into the office and closed the door behind him. "That was some show back there in the mess hall." Rebecca's stomach dropped. "I'm sorry if I caused a scene." You should have done exactly what you did," Cole interrupted. "Morrison's been running his mouth for months, and somebody needed to shut him up. But I'm not." Supposed to? You're not supposed to what? Stand up for yourself? Show some backbone? Cole shook his head. Kid, I've been watching you for the past year, and you know what I see? I see someone who's been beaten down so much she's forgotten how to fight back. Rebecca felt her cheeks burn. I'm not a fighter, Sergeant. I'm an analyst. Bullshit. Cole's voice was sharp. You think I don't know who you are? You think I don't remember your father? The mention of her father made Rebecca's chest tighten. Everyone remembers my father. That's the problem. No, that's not the problem. Cole leaned forward, his eyes intense. The problem is that you think you have to be him to matter. But I flew with Danny Martinez, and you know what made him special. It wasn't his flying, though. He was damn good. It was his ability to see things others missed. He could read weather patterns like a book, find safe passage through storms that would kill other pilots. Rebecca's hands trembled slightly. He died in a storm. He died because he was human, Cole said quietly, because even the best pilots make mistakes. But that doesn't erase everything he accomplished before that night. Cole stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. I was in the tower the night he went down. Watched him take off into conditions that should have been impossible. But he'd found something in the weather data, some pattern that convinced him there was a way through. He was wrong. Was he? Cole turned back to her. We never found his aircraft, Martinez. Never found any debris except that tail section 6 days later. For all we know, he made it through the storm and went down for some other reason. Equipment failure, medical emergency, who knows? Rebecca stared at him. What are you saying? I'm saying that maybe your father wasn't reckless. Maybe he was. Right about the corridor, and something else went wrong. Maybe the son of a bitch was too good at reading the wind for his own good. Cole moved toward the door, then paused. I've been watching you work, Martinez. The way you study weather patterns, the way you map wind corridors by hand. You've got your father's gift, but you've been so busy trying not to be him that you've forgotten what made him special. As Cole left, Rebecca sat alone in the quiet office, surrounded by boxes of maintenance records and the weight of her own uncertainty. Outside, the storm was building, and she could hear the wind beginning to howl against the windows. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to wonder, what if Cole was right? What if her caution wasn't a weakness, but a different kind of strength? What if the very thing that had gotten her grounded, her tendency to analyze rather than act, was actually what made her dangerous? The thought was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Because if Cole was right, then everything she'd been told about herself was wrong. And if that was true, then maybe she had been playing the wrong game all along. Maybe it was time to change the rules. The storm hit Kadina like a living thing, rattling the windows and sending sheets of rain across the tarmac in waves. Rebecca stood in the operations center, watching the weather display with growing concern. The typhoon had shifted course twice in the past hour, defying every prediction model the meteorology team had run. Conditions are deteriorating faster than expected, announced Captain Lisa Park, the base meteorologist. We're looking at sustained winds of over 90 knots, with gusts approaching 120. This is now classified as a super typhoon. Commander Nash stood behind the main console, his jaw tight as he studied the radar feeds. How long until the eye passes? Unknown, sir. The storm's behavior is unusual. It's almost like it's hunting for something. Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She'd been tracking the storm's movement for 3 days, and Captain Park was right. Its behavior was unprecedented. The typhoon was following patterns that didn't match any historical model, creating pockets of stability in impossible locations. Martinez. Nash's voice cut through her thoughts. I need you to cross-reference our current weather data with historical typhoon patterns. See if you can find any precedent for this kind of movement. It was busy work, and they both knew it. But Rebecca nodded and moved to a terminal, grateful for something to do with her hands. As she pulled up the database, she noticed something that made her stomach drop. The storm's current trajectory was almost identical to the one her father had flown through 20 years ago. Not similar identical. The same approach angle, the same speed, even the same erratic shifts in pressure zones. "Sir," she said quietly, "you need to see this." Nash moved to her terminal, his expression skeptical. But as Rebecca overlaid the current storm data with archived records from her father's final flight, his face went pale. "That's impossible," he whispered. "The correlation is over 90%, Rebecca said, her voice shaking. "It's the same storm, sir. I don't know how, but it's the exact same pattern." Nash stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he straightened up and cleared his throat. "Meteorological patterns can repeat. It's rare, but not impossible. Sir, the probability of this level of correlation is, I said it's possible." "Martinez," Nash's voice carried a warning. "I don't want to hear any supernatural theories about ghost storms or unfinished business. We deal in facts here, not folklore." Rebecca felt the familiar sting of dismissal, but this time it was different. This time, she had data to back up her instincts. What if my father was right? What if he found a corridor through the storm? And something else caused the crash? "Your father is dead, Martinez. He died because he took an unnecessary risk." Nash's voice was final. "I won't have you propagating dangerous theories that might encourage other pilots to make the same mistake." The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She'd spent years accepting the official narrative that her father had been reckless, that his death was a cautionary tale about the dangers of overconfidence. But looking at the data now, she saw something else entirely. "Permission to speak." "Freely, sir?" Nash's eyes narrowed. "Denied. I want you to delete this analysis and focus on current conditions only. We don't need ghost stories distracting us from real weather." Rebecca stared at him in disbelief. "You want me to delete scientific data? I want you to follow orders?" The operations center had gone quiet around them. Other personnel were pretending to work while obviously listening to the conversation. Rebecca felt the weight of their attention, the familiar sensation of being watched and judged. "What are you afraid of?" she asked quietly. Nash's face darkened. "What did you say?" "I asked what you're afraid of." Rebecca's voice was stronger now, carrying across the room. "Are you afraid that I might be right? That maybe my father wasn't the reckless pilot you've been telling everyone he was? Martinez, you're out of line. Am I? Or am I finally asking the right questions?" Rebecca stood up, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "You were his squadron leader. You signed off on his flight plan. If he was being reckless, why did you let him go?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Nash's face had gone white, and Rebecca could see something in his eyes, guilt, maybe, or fear. Around them, the operations center was dead silent, except for the sound of rain hammering against the windows. "Security," Nash said quietly. "I need Martinez escorted from the building." "Sir?" The security guard looked confused. "On what grounds?" "Insubordination, failure to follow direct orders, and spreading dangerous theories that could compromise flight safety." Rebecca felt the world tilt around her. "You can't be serious." "I'm deadly serious. You're confined to quarters pending a formal review. And Martinez?" Nash stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "If you breathe a word of this ghost storm theory to anyone, I'll have you court-martialed for conduct. I'm becoming. Do I make myself clear?" The security guard approached reluctantly, his hand resting on his radio. "Ma'am, I need you to come with me." Rebecca looked around the room at faces that wouldn't meet her eyes. These were people she'd worked with for over a year, people who'd watched her struggle to prove herself worthy of their respect. Now they were watching her be humiliated and doing nothing to stop it. "This isn't over," she said quietly. Nash's smile was cold. "Yes, it is. You're done, Martinez. Your father's ghost can't protect you anymore." As the security guard led her from the building, Rebecca felt something break inside her chest. Not her spirit that was still intact. What broke was her faith in the system, her belief that competence and dedication would eventually be rewarded. She'd played by their rules, accepted their judgment, and tried to earn their respect through quiet service. It hadn't been enough. It would never be enough. But as she walked through the rain toward the barracks, Rebecca realized that she was done playing their game. She had data they wanted to ignore, knowledge they were afraid to acknowledge, and skills they dismissed as inadequate. Most importantly, she had her father's flight log, with its careful notations and hand-drawn charts. And she had Juliet 4, sitting in Hangar 3, with its fuel lines connected and its systems ready. The storm was still building, creating the same impossible corridors her father had mapped 20 years ago. Nash could confine her to quarters, but he couldn't change the laws of physics. The wind would blow where it wanted to blow, and the corridors would open whether anyone was watching or not. Rebecca Martinez had spent 18 months being careful, being quiet, being everything they'd asked her to be. Tonight, she was going to remember who she really was. The daughter of a man who died trying to prove that impossible things were possible, and she was going to finish what he'd started. Rebecca's quarters felt like a prison cell, complete with the sound of rain hammering against the window like accusations. She sat on her narrow bunk, staring at her father's flight log, while the storm raged outside. The pages were yellow with age, but his handwriting was still clear, precise notations about wind patterns, pressure zones, and the hidden geometry of typhoons. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door to find Technical Sergeant Rodriguez standing in the hallway, her jacket soaked with rain. "Can I come in?" Rebecca glanced around nervously. "I'm supposed to be confined to quarters. If they find out you're here, they won't." Rodriguez stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "I brought you something." She handed Rebecca a manila envelope. Inside were copies of maintenance records, flight logs, and what looked like official correspondence. Rebecca's hands shook as she recognized the letterhead. These were documents from her father's final mission. "Where did you get these?" "Sergeant, Cole has been collecting them for 20 years, Rodriguez said quietly. "He never believed the official story about your father's crash. Neither did a lot of other people, but nobody wanted to speak up." Rebecca spread the documents across her small desk. There were fuel consumption reports, weather briefs, and most importantly, a copy of her father's original flight plan, not the sanitized version that had been released to the family, but the actual document he'd filed with operations. "My God," she whispered. He wasn't being reckless. He was following a calculated flight path based on real weather data. "Keep reading," Rodriguez said grimly. The next document was a meteorological report dated 3 days after the crash. It showed that her father's predicted corridor had indeed formed, exactly when and where he'd calculated it would. But there was something else, a note in the margin, written in Nash's handwriting. "Suppress this analysis. Could encourage similar risks." Rebecca felt her blood turn to ice. Nash knew. He knew my father was right, and he covered it up. "It gets worse." Rodriguez pulled out a final document, a maintenance report on Juliet 4 from the day before the crash. "Your father requested an inspection of his aircraft's navigation systems. He'd been experiencing intermittent failures for weeks, but the reports were marked as non-critical and pushed to the bottom of the maintenance queue." Rebecca read the report with growing horror. Her father had documented multiple instances of compass deviation, altimeter fluctuations, and radio interference. He'd requested priority maintenance, but Nash had overruled the request, citing operational necessities. He sent my father into a storm with faulty equipment, Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper, and then spent 20 years telling everyone that Daniel Martinez died because he was reckless. Rodriguez's voice was tight with anger. Cole's been trying to get justice for your father, but every time he brings it up, he gets transferred or reassigned. Nash has been protecting himself by destroying your father's reputation. Rebecca's hands clenched into fists, the rage building. Inside her was unlike anything she'd ever felt, white-hot and focused, like the afterburner of a jet engine. For 20 years, she'd carried the weight of her father's supposed recklessness. For 20 years, she'd tried to prove that she was different, that she was careful and cautious and deserving of respect. All of it had been based on a lie. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. Rodriguez met her eyes. "Because the same storm that killed your father is out there right now, and Nash is planning to send pilots into it without proper weather analysis. He's so afraid of being exposed that he's willing to risk lives to maintain his cover-up." As if summoned by her words, the base's emergency sirens began to wail. Through the window, Rebecca could see activity on the flight line crews moving with urgent purpose. Aircraft being prepped for launch despite the deteriorating conditions. "They're scrambling fighters," Rodriguez said, checking her radio. Nash convinced command we need to establish air superiority before the storm passes. He's sending 6 jets into conditions that should ground everything on the base. Rebecca's blood ran cold. He's going to get them killed. Not if someone stops him. Rodriguez handed her a small device, a maintenance access card. "This will get you into any hangar on the base." Cole made sure Juliet 4 is fueled and ready. Rebecca stared at the card. "You're asking me to steal a fighter jet. I'm asking you to finish what your father started. To prove that he was right, and that Nash has been lying for 20 years. Rodriguez moved toward the door. "But I'm not asking you to do it alone." She opened the door to reveal Sergeant Cole waiting in the hallway, along with 2 other maintenance technicians Rebecca recognized but had never spoken to. They were all wearing rain gear and carrying equipment bags. "We've been waiting 20 years for this moment," Cole said quietly. "Your father was a good man who died because of another man's cowardice. We're not going to let Nash repeat that mistake." Rebecca looked at their faces, weathered, determined, and absolutely certain. These were people who'd spent their careers keeping aircraft flying, who understood the difference between acceptable risk and criminal negligence. They were offering her something she'd never had before, allies. "What about consequences?" she asked. "If I take that jet, Nash will have you all court-martialed." Cole smiled grimly. "Martinez, we're all within 2 years of retirement. We've got more to lose by staying quiet than by speaking up. Besides, if you're right about that storm corridor, you'll have proof that Nash has been covering up a crime." Rebecca looked down at her father's flight log, its pages filled with careful calculations and precise observations. Then she looked at the maintenance records that proved Nash's betrayal. Finally, she looked at the faces of people who'd been silenced for 20 years, waiting for someone with the courage to speak truth to power. "What do you need me to do?" Rodriguez handed her a set of flight gear. "Get dressed. We'll handle the rest." As Rebecca pulled on her father's old flight suit, the one that had been returned to her after his death, she felt something shift inside her chest. The careful, cautious analyst was still there, but she was no longer in control. Rising to take her place was someone harder, more focused, and absolutely determined to see justice done. Her father had died trying to prove that impossible things were possible. Tonight, she was going to prove that dead men could still win battles, and that sometimes the only way to honor the past was to refuse to let it stay buried. The hangar was dark, except for the emergency lighting that cast long shadows across the concrete floor. Rebecca moved through the shadows like a ghost, her father's flight suit fitting her perfectly despite the 20 years between them. Sergeant Cole and his team worked with practiced efficiency, running final checks on Juliet 4 while keeping one eye on the access doors. "Avionics are green," whispered Rodriguez, her voice barely audible over the storm raging outside. "Navigation system shows full functionality. Your father would be proud." Rebecca ran her hand along the aircraft's fuselage, feeling the slight vibration of systems coming online. The jet was older than the newer models, but it had been maintained with the kind of meticulous care that only came from people who understood what it represented. "Weather report shows the corridor forming exactly where your father predicted," Cole said, handing her a printout. "It'll be stable for about 90 seconds, maybe less." "That's your window." Rebecca studied the data, comparing it to her father's original charts. The patterns were identical, the same pressure zones, the same wind shear characteristics, the same impossible gap in the storm wall that shouldn't exist but did. "What about the other aircraft?" she asked. Cole's expression darkened. "Nash launched them 15 minutes ago. 6 F-15s heading straight into the storm's core. No weather analysis, no corridor mapping, just brute force and bad judgment." Rebecca felt her chest tighten. "He's going to get them killed." "Not if you prove there's a safe route through." Rodriguez climbed the maintenance ladder to double-check the cockpit systems. "But you need to understand, once you take off, there's no going back. Nash will throw everything he has at stopping you." Through the hangar's windows, Rebecca could see the storm's fury intensifying. Lightning split the sky in jagged white lines, and the wind howled with a voice that seemed almost human. 6 pilots were out there somewhere, flying blind into conditions that had killed her father 20 years ago. "I need to contact them," she said suddenly. "If I can reach them on the emergency frequency." "Nash has locked down all communications," Cole interrupted. "He's classified this as a security operation. The only way to help those pilots is to prove that your father's route works." Rebecca nodded, understanding the weight of what she was about to do. This wasn't just about clearing her father's name anymore. It was about saving lives. She climbed into the cockpit and began the startup sequence, her hands moving with muscle memory that stretched back to her childhood. The engine spooled up with a throaty roar that seemed to shake the entire hangar. Rebecca could feel the aircraft's power thrumming through the seat, begging to be released. She'd forgotten how it felt to sit in a real fighter, to be connected to something that could turn thought into motion at the speed of sound. "All systems show green," she called down to Cole. "I'm ready." Cole stepped back from the aircraft, his weathered face serious. "Martinez, if you don't make it back, I will." Rebecca's voice was steady and certain. "My father didn't die because he was wrong. He died because Nash sent him up in a broken aircraft. Tonight I'm going to prove the difference." The hangar. Doors began to open, revealing the storm-lashed tarmac beyond. Rain swept through the opening in sheets, and Rebecca could see the control tower's lights flickering in the wind. Somewhere in that tower, Nash was probably watching radar contacts and wondering why one of his grounded aircraft was showing signs of life. Rebecca taxied out of the hangar with deliberate slowness, giving the storm time to reveal its patterns. The wind caught the aircraft's wings, trying to push it sideways, but she corrected with subtle inputs that kept the jet centered on the taxiway. The radio crackled to life. "Unknown aircraft, this is Kadina Tower. You are not cleared for taxi. Identify yourself immediately." Rebecca didn't respond. She was watching the clouds, reading the wind's language the way her mother had taught her 20 years ago. The corridor was forming, just as her father had predicted. She could see the gap beginning to open not on radar, not on satellite imagery, but in the way the storm breathed. Juliet 4. This is Commander Nash. You are ordered to shut down immediately and return to the hangar. Still no response. Rebecca reached the end of the runway and began her final checks. Engine temperatures were nominal, fuel flow was steady, and all flight controls responded properly. Unlike her father's final flight, she was going up in an aircraft that wouldn't fail her. The radio exploded with activity. Security to runway 1. Stop that aircraft by any means necessary. Rebecca saw the security vehicles racing toward her position, their lights flashing through the rain. She had perhaps 30 seconds before they blocked her path. The corridor was opening, the storm wall beginning to part just enough to reveal the passage her father had died trying to find. She advanced the throttles to full military power. Juliet 4 leaped forward like a caged animal suddenly set free. The acceleration pressed Rebecca back into her seat as the aircraft gathered speed, eating up runway in chunks of concrete and asphalt. The security vehicles were closing in, but they couldn't match the physics of a fighter jet committed to flight. The wheels left the ground just as the first security vehicle reached the runway. Rebecca felt the moment of transition, the subtle shift from rolling to flying, from earthbound to airborne. The storm reached for her immediately, trying to swat her down with crosswinds and turbulence that would have destroyed a lesser aircraft. But Juliet 4 was built for this, and Rebecca was her father's daughter. She climbed into the storm's mouth, following the path her father had charted 20 years ago. The corridor was there, exactly where it should be, a narrow channel of stable air threading through the chaos, like a secret passage known only to those who understood the storm's true nature. The aircraft shuddered as it entered the typhoon's outer bands, but Rebecca held the flight path steady. Rain hammered the canopy like machine gun fire, and lightning illuminated the clouds around her in brief, terrifying snapshots. But inside the corridor, the air was different, still turbulent, but manageable, flyable. Her father had been right. All aircraft, this is Raven 1, a voice crackled over the emergency frequency. We're encountering severe turbulence and zero visibility, requesting immediate vector to safe airspace. Rebecca's blood ran cold. That was Lieutenant Morrison's voice, and she could hear the edge of panic beneath his usual confidence. The 6 aircraft Nash had launched were in trouble, flying blind through the storm's deadliest sections while a safe passage existed just kilometers away. She keyed her radio to the emergency frequency. Raven Flight, this is Juliet 4. I have eyes on a stable corridor bearing 270 at Angels 15. Follow my lead for safe passage. A long silence followed, broken only by the sound of wind and rain. Then Morrison's voice came back, tight with disbelief. Juliet 4, identify yourself. Who authorized your launch? Negative on identification. Time is critical. The corridor is collapsing. If you want to live, follow my heading and stay in my wake. Rebecca could hear other voices on the frequency, now pilots arguing, calling for confirmation, demanding to know who she was. But underneath their words, she could hear something else. The sound of aircraft in distress, engines straining against conditions they weren't meant to handle. This is Raven 2. A new voice cut through the chatter. I've got engine flame out. On number 1, I need immediate assistance. That decided it. Rebecca banked hard left, following the corridor's curve as it threaded between towering walls of cloud. Behind her, she could see the faint glow of the other aircraft's navigation lights struggling through the darkness. Raven Flight, mark my position and follow exactly in my flight path. Do not deviate. The corridor is narrow and unforgiving. One by one, the 6 fighters fell into line behind her. Rebecca led them through the storm's heart, following her father's charts with religious precision. Every turn, every altitude change, every subtle correction, All of it had been mapped 20 years ago by a man who died before he could prove. His calculations were correct. The radio was full of noise now. Nash's voice cutting through the static, demanding answers, ordering the aircraft to return to base immediately. Other voices: search and rescue, meteorology, base operations, all trying to understand how 7 aircraft were flying through a super typhoon without being torn apart. Juliet 4. This is Colonel Williams. A new voice entered the frequency. Williams was the base commander, Nash's superior. You are ordered to identify yourself and explain your unauthorized launch. Rebecca smiled grimly. Colonel, I'm Captain Daniel Martinez's daughter, flying his route through a storm that killed him 20 years ago. And I have 6 aircraft behind me that would be dead right now if I hadn't taken off. Silence on the radio. Then Williams' voice, quieter now. Martinez, is that you? Yes, sir. And I have proof that my father wasn't reckless. He was murdered. The words hung in the static-filled air like an accusation. Rebecca knew she'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, but she didn't care anymore. The truth had been buried for 20 years, and it was time to dig it up. Explain yourself, Captain. My father filed a flight plan based on accurate weather analysis. Commander Nash ignored his equipment failure reports and sent him into this storm with faulty navigation systems. Then he covered it up by claiming my father was being reckless. Another long silence. Rebecca could imagine the chaos in the control tower, Nash trying to explain himself, Williams demanding answers, and everyone suddenly understanding that the quiet support officer had just accused a senior commander of murder. Juliet 4. Maintain current heading. All other aircraft follow Juliet 4's lead until further notice. The corridor was beginning to narrow as they approached the storm's far side. Rebecca could see clearer air ahead, but she knew the most dangerous part was still coming. The exit from the corridor required precise timing and absolute trust in the calculations her father had made 2 decades ago. All aircraft, prepare for rapid descent in 30 seconds. The corridor ends abruptly, and we need to be below the cloud deck before it collapses. She could hear the tension in the other pilots' voices as they acknowledged her instructions. These were experienced aviators, but they were flying through conditions none of them had ever imagined possible. They were trusting their lives to a woman they dismissed as a failure, following a flight path charted by a dead man. Rebecca began her descent, watching the altimeter unwind as Juliet 4 dropped toward the storm's base. The other aircraft followed in perfect formation, their lights strung out behind her like a constellation navigating through chaos. At 2,000 feet, they broke through the cloud deck into clear air. Below them, the ocean stretched away in all directions, its surface whipped into foam by the storm's fury. But they were through all 7 aircraft, intact and undamaged. Jesus Christ, Morrison's voice came over the radio, filled with awe. She did it. She actually did it. Rebecca felt tears running down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. She'd done more than prove her father's route worked. She'd saved 6 lives and exposed 20 years of lies in the process. All aircraft. This is Colonel Williams. Return to base immediately. There's going to be a full investigation into tonight's events. As the small formation turned toward home, Rebecca looked back at the storm they'd just flown through. Somewhere in those clouds, her father's ghost could finally rest. The truth was out now, and there would be no putting it back in its box. Commander Nash's 20-year cover-up was over. The debriefing room at Kadina had never seen anything like it. 7 pilots sat around a table that usually hosted routine flight reviews, while a stenographer recorded every word for what everyone knew would become a historic military tribunal. Colonel Williams sat at the head of the table, his face grave, as he reviewed the stack of documents that Sergeant Cole had delivered an hour earlier. Commander Nash stood at attention near the window, his silver hair disheveled and his uniform wrinkled. For the first time in Rebecca's memory, he looked like what he was, a tired old man whose carefully constructed lies were finally crumbling around him. "Let me make sure I understand the situation," Colonel Williams said, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years in command. "Captain Martinez took an unauthorized aircraft and flew 6 of our pilots through a super typhoon using navigation data that was 20 years old." "Yes, sir," Rebecca replied. She'd changed out of her father's flight suit and back into her support uniform, but she felt different now, stronger. The quiet analyst was still there, but she was no longer hiding behind careful words and diplomatic silence. "And you're alleging that Commander Nash deliberately suppressed evidence about your father's death, including maintenance reports that showed his aircraft had faulty navigation equipment." "Not alleging, sir. Proving." Rebecca slid a folder across the table. "These are copies of the original maintenance requests my father filed. You can see Nash's signature on the denial forms, marking the repairs as non-critical despite clear evidence of system failures." Colonel Williams studied the documents while the room waited in tense silence. The 6 pilots Rebecca had led through the storm, including Morrison, sat with expressions ranging from embarrassment to outright anger. They'd spent months mocking her abilities, only to discover that she'd just saved their lives using skills they'd dismissed as worthless. "Commander Nash," Williams said finally, "would you care to explain why these maintenance requests were denied?" Nash's jaw tightened. "We were operating under severe resource constraints. Every aircraft was needed for operational readiness. Captain Martinez's requests were deemed bullshit." The word came from Morrison, cutting through Nash's explanation like a blade. "Sir, with respect, we all know that navigation failures are automatic grounding offenses. Nobody flies with faulty instruments, not ever." Williams nodded slowly. "Lieutenant Morrison is correct. Commander Nash, under what authority did you override standard safety protocols?" "I made a command decision based on operational necessities." "You made a command decision that killed a pilot," Rebecca interrupted, her voice steady but filled with controlled fury. "And then you spent 20 years destroying his reputation to cover up your own cowardice." Nash's face flushed red. "You don't know what you're talking about. Your father was reckless, always pushing boundaries, always taking unnecessary risks. My father was right." Rebecca stood up, her hands flat on the table. "He found a safe passage through that storm, and you sent him into it with broken equipment. When he died, you covered it up because you knew an investigation would expose your negligence." "That's enough," Nash snapped. "You're a failed pilot who's been living in her father's shadow for 20 years. Tonight's stunt doesn't change the fact that you don't have what it takes to be a real aviator." The room erupted. Morrison and 2 other pilots started shouting at Nash simultaneously, while Colonel Williams called for order. But Rebecca remained standing, perfectly calm, watching Nash destroy himself with his own words. "You're right about one thing," she said quietly, her voice somehow cutting through the chaos. "I have been living in my father's shadow, but not the way you think." The room fell silent. "I've been living in the shadow of the lie you created about him. The story that he was reckless, that he died because he couldn't control himself. I spent 20 years trying to prove I wasn't him, trying to be careful and cautious and worthy of your approval." Rebecca moved around the table until she was standing directly in front of Nash. "But tonight I learned something important. I'm exactly like my father. We both see things others miss. We both trust our instincts over official procedures. And we both refuse to let fear make our decisions for us." Nash's eyes were wild now, desperate. "Colonel Williams, I demand that Captain Martinez be court-martialed for theft of government property, insubordination, and Commander Nash." Williams' voice was ice cold. "You're relieved of duty pending a full investigation. Report to the provost marshal immediately. Nash stared at him in disbelief. Sir, you can't be serious. I've served this base for over 20 years. And for 20 years, you've been covering up a crime. Williams stood up, his expression hard as granite. Captain Daniel Martinez died because you sent him into a storm with faulty equipment. His daughter just proved that he found a viable route to that storm, which means he would have survived if you'd done your job properly. 2 security officers entered the room as if summoned by Williams' words. Nash looked around desperately, but found no sympathy in any face. Even the pilots who'd served under him were staring at him with disgust and betrayal. This isn't over, Nash said as the security officers approached. She stole a fighter jet. That's a federal crime, regardless of her motivations. Williams smiled grimly. Actually, Commander, Captain Martinez was conducting an unauthorized test flight using procedures developed by her late father. The fact that she saved 6 lives in the process will be taken into consideration during her commendation review. Nash's face went white. Commendation review? The Air Force Cross, most likely. Possibly the Distinguished Flying Cross as well. Williams picked up the stack of documents from the table. 20 years of lies just came to an end, Commander. I suggest you start thinking about how you're going to explain yourself to a military tribunal. As Nash was escorted from the room, Rebecca felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Validation. Not just for tonight's flight, but for 20 years of quiet persistence, careful analysis, and refusing to accept easy answers. Morrison stood up, his face red with embarrassment. Captain Martinez, I owe you an apology. We all do. What we said, how we treated you. Rebecca held up her hand. You treated me the way Nash taught you to. The way he taught everyone to think. About legacy pilots and careful flying and trusting your instruments over your instincts. She looked around the room at faces that were seeing her clearly for the first time. I don't need your apologies, but I do need you to understand something. My father didn't die because he was reckless. He died because someone else was afraid to do the right thing. Colonel Williams nodded. Captain Martinez, effective immediately, you're restored to full flight status. I'm also recommending you for accelerated promotion and assignment to our Weather Reconnaissance Squadron. Rebecca felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. Thank you, sir. But I have one request. Name it. I want to keep flying Juliet 4. It was my father's aircraft, and tonight proved that it still has work to do. Williams smiled. The first genuine smile Rebecca had seen from a superior officer in 20 years. Granted, and Captain, your father would be proud. As the meeting broke up and the other pilots filed out, Rebecca remained behind to collect her father's documents. The room was quiet now, filled with the peaceful silence that comes after truth has finally been spoken. She thought about her father, somewhere in the storm-tossed darkness 20 years ago, flying a broken aircraft through impossible conditions because he'd seen something others had missed. He died before he could prove he was right, but his daughter had finished the job. The ghost in the jet wash could finally rest. And Rebecca Martinez, daughter, pilot, and keeper of difficult truths, was finally free to fly. The courtroom at Kadina's legal building was packed beyond capacity. Military personnel filled every seat, while reporters from major networks crowded the back rows with cameras and notebooks. The story had broken 3 days after Rebecca's flight. Pilot exposed his 20-year cover-up and had quickly become national news. Commander Bradley Nash sat at the defendant's table in a civilian suit, his military career stripped away along with his rank and pension. The man who'd once commanded respect through fear and intimidation now looked small and defeated, flanked by lawyers who'd already advised him to accept a plea bargain. Rebecca sat in the witness section wearing her dress blues, the new captain's bars on her shoulders, catching the fluorescent light. Colonel Williams had fast-tracked her promotion, citing extraordinary circumstances and exceptional service to the Air Force. The military moved quickly when it needed to distance itself from scandal. The court calls Captain Rebecca Martinez to the stand. Rebecca walked to the witness chair with steady steps, her father's flight log tucked under her arm. She'd carried it to every hearing, every interview, every meeting with investigators who'd spent the past week unraveling Nash's 20-year deception. The prosecutor, Major Linda Hayworth, was a sharp-eyed woman with 15 years of military law experience. She'd volunteered for this case. She told Rebecca because she had a daughter who wanted to be a pilot. Captain Martinez, please tell the court about the night of October 15th. Rebecca took a breath and began her testimony. She spoke about the storm, about the hidden corridor her father had mapped, about Nash's refusal to acknowledge evidence that contradicted his official narrative. Her voice was steady and clear, each word carefully chosen and devastating in its precision. And what did you discover about your father's aircraft maintenance records? I discovered that my father had filed multiple requests for emergency repairs to his navigation systems. Compass deviation, altimeter fluctuations, radio interference, all documented and all denied by Commander Nash, despite clear safety protocols requiring immediate grounding. Nash's lead attorney, a civilian named Peterson, stood up. Objection. The witness is speculating about events that occurred 20 years ago. Major Hayworth smiled. Your Honor, the witness is reading from official Air Force maintenance logs signed by the defendant. Overruled. Continue, Captain Martinez. Rebecca opened her father's flight log and read from the pages he'd written in his own hand. October 12, 1995. Filed formal complaint regarding navigation anomalies. Request immediate inspection of INS and backup compass systems. Unable to maintain accurate heading during routine training flights. She turned the page. October 13th. Spoke directly with Commander Nash regarding maintenance delays. Advised that operational tempo requires all aircraft to remain mission-ready. Repairs scheduled for after current storm cycle. The courtroom was dead silent as Rebecca read her father's final entries. Careful, professional notes that painted a picture of a pilot who'd followed every protocol, raised every concern, and been ignored by a commander more worried about mission schedules than aircrew safety. October 14th. Final entry. Weather analysis shows viable corridor through storm system. Navigation equipment still unreliable, but mission requires immediate launch. Will attempt passage based on visual references and backup instruments. If successful, route could revolutionize storm penetration tactics. Rebecca closed the log. My father knew his equipment was compromised. He also knew that 6 other aircraft were scheduled to fly the same mission the following week. He chose to risk his life to prove the route was safe, believing that his sacrifice could save others. In the gallery, she could see Sergeant Cole wiping his eyes. Morrison and the other pilots from that night sat in the front row, their faces grim as they finally understood what Daniel Martinez had died trying to accomplish. Major Hayworth approached the witness stand. Captain Martinez, in your professional opinion, would your father have survived if his aircraft had been properly maintained? Yes, the storm corridor was real, stable, and navigable. My father's calculations were accurate. The only reason he died was equipment failure caused by deferred maintenance. And who was responsible for that maintenance decision? Rebecca looked directly at Nash for the first time since the trial began. His face was pale, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Commander Bradley Nash. He had the authority to ground unsafe aircraft, and he chose not to use it. The defense's cross-examination was brief and ineffective. Peterson tried to suggest that Daniel Martinez had been insubordinate, that his insistence on flying the mission, despite equipment problems, showed poor judgment. But Rebecca's responses were clinical and devastating. "Sir, my father wasn't being insubordinate. He was following direct orders from Commander Nash to complete the mission regardless of equipment status." The maintenance logs show that Nash personally denied 3 separate requests for repair delays. But surely Captain Martinez could have refused to fly? Rebecca's eyes hardened. "Sir, are you suggesting that a pilot should disobey direct orders from his commanding officer? That he should abandon a mission that could save other lives because of personal safety concerns?" Peterson realized his mistake immediately. He was arguing that Daniel Martinez should have been more selfish, more concerned with his own welfare than his duty to his fellow airmen. In a military courtroom, that was career suicide. No further questions. The trial's final witness was Master Sergeant Cole, whose testimony about the systematic suppression of evidence brought several spectators to tears. He'd kept copies of everything: maintenance logs, weather reports, Nash's written orders to classify the investigation findings. 20 years of careful documentation, waiting for someone with the courage to bring it to light. When the prosecution rested, Peterson made one last desperate attempt to salvage his client's case. He called character witnesses who testified about Nash's long service record, his dedication to the Air Force, his years of competent leadership. But the damage was done. The evidence was overwhelming, the cover-up undeniable. Nash had sent a pilot to his death with faulty equipment, then spent 20 years destroying that pilot's reputation to protect himself. The verdict came back in less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. Criminal negligence, obstruction of justice, conduct unbecoming an officer. Nash was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution to the Martinez family. As the judge read the sentence, Rebecca felt a weight she'd carried for 20 years finally lift from her shoulders. Justice had been served, but more importantly, the truth had been told. Her father's name was cleared, his reputation restored. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded Rebecca with cameras and microphones. She answered their questions with the same calm precision she'd brought to the witness stand, explaining the technical aspects of storm navigation and the importance of proper maintenance protocols. "Captain Martinez, how does it feel to finally have justice for your father?" Rebecca considered the question. "My father didn't need justice, he needed truth. The justice is for all the pilots who will fly safer missions because this cover-up has been exposed. What's next for you?" Rebecca smiled, thinking of Juliet 4 waiting in the hangar, ready for their next mission together. "I'm going flying. There are still storms out there, and my father taught me how to read them." As she walked away from the cameras, Rebecca felt her father's presence like a warm wind at her back. The ghost in the jet wash was finally at peace. His work completed by the daughter who'd refused to let his legacy be buried in lies. The sky was calling, and for the first time in 20 years, Rebecca Martinez was free to answer. 6 months after Nash's conviction, Rebecca stood on the tarmac at Kadina, watching a new class of pilots prepare for their first storm intercept training. The typhoon season had brought fresh challenges, and the Weather Reconnaissance Squadron had become the most requested assignment on the base. "Remember," she called to the group of nervous aviators, "the storm isn't your enemy. It's a puzzle, and every piece of data tells you something about the solution." Lieutenant Morrison recently promoted after exemplary performance under Rebecca's command raised his hand. "Captain, what if the instruments disagree with visual assessment?" Rebecca smiled. "Trust your instruments, but understand their limitations. Technology fails, but the laws of physics never lie. If something feels wrong, there's probably a reason." She moved to the tactical display board, where satellite imagery showed the current storm system approaching from the southeast. The familiar patterns were their pressure zones, wind shear markers. the subtle signatures that revealed hidden corridors through the chaos. "Who can tell me what we're looking at?" A young pilot named Lieutenant Amy Foster stepped forward. "Ma'am, I see the main storm eye here, with feeder bands extending northeast and southwest. But there's an anomaly in the pressure gradient around Sector 7. Good eye, Foster. That anomaly is what my father would have called a breathing space, a place where the storm's rotation creates a pocket of stability. It won't last long, but it's navigable if you know how to read the signs." Rebecca had restructured the entire training program, incorporating her father's techniques with modern technology. Pilots now learn to interpret multiple data sources simultaneously: satellite imagery, radar returns, visual cues, and most importantly, their own intuition developed through careful observation. "Captain Martinez?" Another voice from the back of the group. "Is it true that you learned to fly by watching your parents track hurricanes?" Rebecca nodded. "My mother taught me to read weather patterns before I could read books. She'd spread maps on the floor and have me trace the wind currents with colored markers. The storm doesn't speak in the center, she'd say. It speaks in the seams." The memory still brought a smile to her face. 2 weeks ago, her mother had visited the base for the first time since Daniel's death. They'd spent hours in the weather center, comparing notes and sharing observations. The quiet woman who'd retired in grief had slowly begun to emerge from her self-imposed exile, drawn back to the sky by her daughter's vindication of her husband's work. "The most important thing to remember," Rebecca continued, "is that flying isn't about conquering the air. It's about enjoying the conversation between wind and wing, between possibility and physics." My father understood that. It's why he could find passages that others missed. After the briefing, Rebecca walked to Hangar 3, where Juliet 4 waited in pristine condition. Sergeant Cole had retired, but continued to volunteer his time maintaining the aircraft, refusing to let anyone else service the machine that had finally cleared Daniel Martinez's name. "She's ready for today's mission," Cole said, running his hand along the fuselage with obvious affection. "Weather reports show perfect conditions for advanced corridor training." Rebecca nodded, checking the maintenance logs out of habit. Everything was perfect, systems tested, fuel topped off, emergency equipment verified. The aircraft that had once been treated as a museum piece was now the flagship of the squadron, flown daily by the daughter who'd inherited her father's gift for reading the sky. The afternoon training flight took them through a moderate storm system, nothing like the super typhoon that had changed everything 6 months ago. But for the new pilots, it was their first real test of skills learned in simulators and classroom lectures. Rebecca led the formation through the storm's outer bands, calling out observations and corrections as they navigated the turbulent air. Behind her, 8 F-15s followed in perfect formation, their pilots learning to trust their training and their instincts in equal measure. "Raven flight marked the pressure change at your 11 o'clock position," she radioed. "See how the clouds spiral differently there? That's your indicator for wind shear." One by one, the pilots acknowledged her instructions, their voices gaining confidence as they began to see the patterns she described. This was what she dreamed of during those long months in exile, not just flying again, but teaching others. To see what she saw, to understand what her father had understood. The mission ended with a perfect landing and a flawless debrief. Every pilot had successfully navigated their assigned corridor, demonstrating the skills that would keep them alive in conditions that had once been considered unsurvivable. As the squadron dispersed, Morrison lingered behind. "Captain, I wanted to thank you again for what you did that night. If you hadn't taken off..." Rebecca held up her hand. "You don't need to thank me, Jake. We're pilots. We look out for each other." Morrison nodded, then paused at the hangar entrance. "Your father would be proud, you know? Not just of what you've accomplished, but of who you've become." After he left, Rebecca sat alone in the cockpit of Juliet 4, listening to the evening wind whistle through the hangar. The base was quiet now, most personnel off duty or preparing for the next day's operations. But the wind never stopped, and there were always new patterns to read, new storms to understand. She opened her father's flight log, now supplemented with her own observations and discoveries, and made her daily entry. Weather conditions, student performance, equipment status, and the small insights that accumulated over time into wisdom. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new storms, new opportunities to push the boundaries of what was possible. The typhoon season was just beginning, and there were young pilots who needed to learn that the sky wasn't something to be conquered, but something to be understood. Rebecca closed the log and climbed down from the cockpit, her boots ringing against the metal ladder. She paused to run her hand along the aircraft's wing, feeling the subtle vibration of air moving over aluminum and remembering the first time she'd seen an F-15 climb through a typhoon wall. She'd been 8 years old then, standing barefoot beside a chain-link fence while her father disappeared into the storm. She'd felt awe and terror in equal measure, watching afterburners cut through rain that sent palm trees bowing sideways. Now she was the one climbing into impossible weather, carrying forward the work her father had begun. The little girl who'd traced wind patterns on her mother's maps had become the pilot who mapped safe passages through deadly storms. The circle was complete, but the story wasn't over. Every flight brought new discoveries. Every storm revealed new secrets. The sky was infinite, and there was always more to learn. Rebecca Martinez had been born in the jet wash of her father's dreams. Now, she was creating the thermal currents that would lift the next generation of pilots toward their own impossible achievements. Some stories don't end. They transform, carrying forward the dreams of those who came before, while building foundations for those who will follow. In the language of wind and wing, in the conversation between courage and caution, the legacy continues. The ghost in the jet wash had found its peace. The daughter who'd inherited its mission was just getting started. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. If this story resonated with you, think about someone in your own life who refused to give up when everyone else had stopped believing. Sometimes the most powerful victories are won not with grand gestures, but with quiet persistence and the courage to trust your own eyes when others refuse to see. The sky is vast, and there's always room for one more person willing to read the wind.